Hello everyone and welcome again to Lessons from the Table. My name is Matt Carroll. I'm a DM and I'm going to talk about another lesson that I learned in my time DMing. Again, I want to go back to something I learned quite early on. Those of you who watched episode 1 know one of the very first things I learned and how embarrassing some of my stupidity was and some of the mistakes I made were. Maybe this is going to be a little bit similar. So for today's episode, I want to discuss something that's kind of obvious, but also really isn't a lot of the time when we play to our strengths, especially for those of you who, hopefully you're my viewer base, watch a lot of media of DMs giving advice. Often we watch that media because we're trying to learn new things, we're trying to improve at the things we're bad at. This lesson that I had to learn, and I learned it from watching a lot of these, and sometimes sucking at the things they were trying to teach me. Play to your strengths. Play to your strengths. As a DM, play to your strengths. I know what my strengths are. A lot of DMs kind of don't, and that's the funny thing. We're always very aware of our weaknesses, but we're not always aware of our strengths. My strength as a DM, I have a background in writing, so I am very good at building worlds. That's easily my biggest strength. Like, it's not just geographically, but culturally, everything, like with great depth and detail. I'm very good at building worlds. And a lot of the first campaign I ran plays to this strength by having my characters often having to travel to new parts of the world, traveling across large geographic distances and noticing the cultures and customs shift as they moved between nations, seeing how the commerce was different, looking in the maps and seeing the difference of naming conventions for towns, how different cultures maybe named things differently. And that's to say nothing of racial differences as well. Also how those racial differences played into that in the campaign of this world. And it's actually the world I'm still running my current campaign in. There's a very simple premise. Most of the major races exist in major nations across a series of quite large islands. There's also a large continental landmass, and this is very exactly based on a kind of pseudo-United States that used to be owned by the dwarves, and then the dwarves went completely missing, so all of the other races went about and colonized that area, which meant that there were differences in, who colonized first and why. The humans went there first. That affected things. It meant there was a lot more humans than anyone else in most parts. It also meant that their customs, cultures, and traditions had shaped this new land more than any other race had. But further to the north was ever so slightly more elven. That was where more of the elven colonies had been. Now, it wasn't exclusively elves, but it meant that when civil war erupted between basically independents and loyalists, independents who wanted to incorporate as their own set of nation states, and loyalists who were, funnily enough, loyal to the homeland, the independents were the predominantly human south. The reason for this, I'll touch on in a second, whereas the loyalists were the predominantly elven north, who are longer lived. That was very important, because this world has two moons. I know on the surface that seems like it doesn't mean anything, but it has two moons. One of them is in a tidally locked orbit. The other is on a massive elliptical orbit. So basically, when the moon on the wide elliptical orbit is at the furthest point of its orbit, it is having minimal influence on the tides. And the other one is tidally locked. That means the oceans and tides are extremely stable. Weather is predictable. Things are navigable. Then as it comes closer, the world comes into what's known as an age of storms. As the second moon passes closer to the planet, it interacts with the tides and disrupts things a lot more, and that's to say nothing of where the other moon may be positioned at that particular time. Suddenly, things are unpredictable, tides are changeable, and it's called the Age of Storms, because there are a lot more storms. The oceans become functionally innavigable. And the argument of the independents was, we are going to be cut off from our homelands for the next 50 to 70 years. We need to be strong, we need to be united, because if whatever came for the dwarves comes for us, we need to be ready for it. The elves, on the other hand, are much more long-lived. They were looking longer term than that. 50 years for a human is most of a lifetime. 50 years for an elf is barely any of a lifetime. They were going, well, after this Age of Storms, we're going to have to answer to our homelands. that sent people here to colonize these places, that are ideally seeing us as a long-term investment, and they'll be able to make money off us via trade, and we will make money off them. We will mutually benefit. So that was the argument of the longer-lived races. That was the argument of the loyalists, and a civil war ended up erupting basically over this straight ideological difference. Now, my players ended up allying themselves throughout the course of this campaign with the independents, and that meant that every time they were in loyalist lands, things were fundamentally different. They were in enemy territory. They had to be careful who they spoke to, who they revealed themselves to. If they were there on a particular mission, they had to be very, very careful what they said so as to not A, give away that they were on a mission, B, give away that they were independents, and C, even worse, give away details of the mission to the enemy. And they had to do things like break people out of high security prisoner of war camps, things like that. This war was a very significant part of the campaign, and that meant in different areas the players had to feel like a war was happening. And this played into every single part of my campaign. The North was less populous. There were less people there in general than further south. They had less of an army that they could mobilize. But they had a technological advantage, which meant they built a lot of constructs. So when the players were fighting more northward, they would come across a squad. There was a commander and 5 constructs of some variety. I ended up introducing Warforged to the world through this. I used a Homebrew template. By now, there is an official Warforged out in the Eberron supplement that was recently released, which is pretty rad. And now in my campaign, in this exact same world, I use that Warforged template rather than the Homebrew one that I was using at the time. I'm more than happy to link the Homebrew one, by the way, for those of you who are interested. That'll be in the doobly-doo. And then further south, it was people. It was predominantly, meat armies. I feel like that's a weird term, but you get what I mean, right? It was humans. It was rank and file troops. It wasn't constructs. It wasn't things built for the purpose of war. It was trained soldiers for the most part, and the effects of this were felt everywhere. In the earliest parts of the game, it was very hard for my players to acquire heavier armor, because most of the blacksmiths in the world had been commissioned to make armor for the war effort, and weapons as well. It was very hard for them to get full plate until they were able to get close enough with the independent army that the army was able to provide them with sets of armor, which they didn't have to pay for. So that was kind of the trade-off there. So what does this have to do with playing to my strengths? Well, like I said, I am confident in my ability to build a robust world and make the realities of that world apparent in every way, shape, and form. From the flavor of the place, the cultures, the people they're interacting with, right the way down to how it affects combats. When they were further north, they had a lot more combats against constructs. When they were further south, there was one particular part that revolved around basically a weak king and a warlord that was attempting to rise up against him. They fought exclusively humans. And that was a significant difference. That's a difference that existed because of the world it was set in. That's not something I could just lift and drop in to Eberron, at least not as cleanly, or lift and drop into the Forgotten Realms, or lift and drop into Barovia, whatever you want, right? I'm probably saying that wrong. I've never heard it said out loud before, sue me. But I'm confident in my ability to build a world, so I played to that strength. And every time my players interacted with the thing that was to do with how I built the world, they were very satisfied. Now, there are things that I'm not very good at. Now, when I said play to your strengths right at the beginning of this video, I bet the first thing you all thought about was the thing you're bad at. And for those of you who aren't great at world building, when I said I'm great at world building, you probably thought, oh, I'm really bad at world building, rather than thinking about what you're good at. Because everyone's good at something. I'm terrible at coming up with traps. That is my biggest weakness as a DM by far and wide. I've got a lot better at a lot of other things that I was weak on earlier on, and those of you who watched episode 1 will remember this. I wasn't that great at designing combats. I'm still only a little bit better at it, right? I'm better at designing monsters and picking what makes a good combat and pushing players to their limits. I'm not always great at designing combats that are more than just, kill everything else. I'm not good at designing combats that are more dynamic than that. I'm getting better. That's the thing I'm currently learning. That's one of the things I watch all these sorts of videos for. So in watching this video, you shouldn't be trying to learn how to become a good world builder. I'm probably going to make a number of videos, in fact, on that subject matter later on down the line. What I want you to think about while you're watching this video and also after it, I want you to think about what you're good at. Are you good at weaving player backstories into your campaign world? Are you good at engaging all of your players with excellent description? Are you good at designing incredibly satisfying combats? Are you good at designing dungeons? Are you good at designing traps? Are you good at designing complex political systems that the players can have intrigue stories weaved into? Are you good at anything? What are you good at? Figure that out and play to that strength. It doesn't mean your campaign should only be that. Just because you're good at combat, just because you're good at designing it rather, doesn't mean the entirety of your game should just be your players rolling initiative after initiative after initiative and just fighting things endlessly. That's boring. It's repetitive. You've got to have a variety, right? But play to your strengths. My strength was world building, so I designed a campaign that inherently had my players interacting with the complex and robust world. And the choices they made affected the world. And the events that happened in the world affected my players, often based on the choices that they had made. And my players found it incredibly satisfying. It was one of the biggest things I got compliments on, actually, when I talked to my players at various points throughout the campaign to sort of check in with where we were and how people were finding things. I was getting feedback on, I think combats could be a little bit more dynamic. I think you could be including other things. There's not quite so many traps, stuff like that. But I got very positive feedback on things relating to the world building. And you'll get the same with your strength if you play to it. So just for now, I know you're out here looking at these sorts of videos to try and learn new things, to try and improve on the things you're weak at. But let's start with the things you're good at and play to those strengths. Thank you very much for tuning in once again to Lessons from the Table. I've been Matt Carroll. You've been beautiful. See you next time.